The world's first empire has collapsed. The great experiment of Sargon of Akkad, built on the power of the sword and the personality of one man, has failed, leaving behind chaos and a central question: how do you build a power that doesn't die with you? While the Gutian mountain tribes plundered the weakened cities, the answer to this question was maturing in the south, in the ancient lands of Sumer. It would be an answer written not only with weapons, but with law. Today we will see how the first bureaucratic superpower in history, the Third Dynasty of Ur, is born from the ashes of Akkad, and how its ideas are brought to perfection by the legendary lawgiver king from a city that would become a synonym for greatness, Babylon. As soon as the Gutian nomads either weakened or their raids became less intense, we see a new state being reborn in these same territories. But this time it's Sumerian. It is centered in the city of Ur, not the Uruk of Gilgamesh. Please don't confuse them. Not Lagash, where Gudea was. Not Akkad, which was the capital of the Akkadian Empire. A state arises with its center in the city of Ur. We call it the Third Dynasty of Ur. Well, because in Ur, it was the Third Dynasty. In fact, if you've heard of it, this was a country whose kings held the official title King of Sumer and Akkad. So, finally, these people unified the lands. They understood that Sumer and Akkad had more or less become one and the same. And so they began to call themselves the King of Sumer and Akkad, and the state was called the Sumerian Akkadian state. This was the next attempt to build an extensive state. Coincidentally, it was also the first attempt in history to build a totalitarian state. That is, it's hard to call it completely totalitarian, but it was an attempt to build specifically totalitarian control. The people understood perfectly well that Sargon and the Akkadians had failed to hold on to the cities because they lacked control. They lacked control over these cities, control over the elite, control over the priesthood, control over the gods, and ultimately control over people's minds. That's what they lacked in their time. The influence of the Akkadians reached as far as India, because by this time, we do find Mesopotamian artifacts in Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. That is, they had trade, most likely through the Persian Gulf, because one of Naram Sin's expeditions went south to Oman, along the Persian Gulf. For a second, that's quite a long way. And their trade reached the Indus Valley. They were beginning to trade with them at this time. Just so people understand, the Third Dynasty of Ur and the Sumerian Akkadian state, this is around the year 2000 BCE. So think 2025, but BCE, this is the second attempt to build a large state. This is the Third Dynasty of Ur. These are kings like Ur-Nammu and Shulgi. Most of the sources that have reached us, the tablets and everything else, belong to this era. About 200,000 clay tablets from this period have been found. It's a huge amount of information, though. Of course, it's predominantly economic. For example, the famous ziggurat of the city of Ur, this beauty right here, belongs to this era. Very often today, when they find ziggurats that are broken or damaged by time, they look to the ziggurat of Ur as a model for restoration. A ziggurat is a type of temple complex, and this one is the main reference point. It has been restored based on this example. That is, maybe not all ziggurats in Mesopotamia looked like this, but at least some of them looked similar. Therefore, it's generally accepted that this was the model for such structures, and it's become the standard for all reconstructions. So this is how it looked in Ur. What it looked like in other cities is unknown. But this has become the classic image, and ziggurats everywhere are depicted only in this way and no other. The thing is, this was the second attempt to build a large state. And do you understand what's going on here? Why is it called totalitarian? Because it was decided that giving all these cities self-governance was not a very good idea. Therefore, when the government of the Third Dynasty of Ur arrived somewhere, when the Sumerian Akkadian state took over, it was considered that all land belonged to the state. All land belongs to this is an even more abstract idea. The land you cultivate is now not yours, but some kind of government property. It would have been quite difficult to explain this to more ancient people in Mesopotamia because it's an abstraction. What do you mean? I live here, I work this land. You want me to pay you a tax, some thug, so you don't plunder me? Fine, here, take it. But to declare that the land I live on is actually not my land and not your land, but belongs to some abstract state, that's a concept on a whole new level. Over about 1,000 years, from the third to the second millennium BCE, this idea had matured. The idea that there exists some kind of governmental state, an abstract state on whose land we labor. In principle, as we now know, this idea wouldn't last for long either. This state would also fall, partly because it would be hated for, to put it bluntly, taking away the land. But the attempt to justify their power was based on this. It was like, look, the heavens are unified. Have you ever seen cities in the heavens? Have you seen Although, by the way, not all of their gods live in the heavens. They have gods who live on earth and under the earth, but for the most part, it was believed that the gods hang out in the heavens. And they would say, look at the heavens. Do you see cities there among the gods? Number. The gods don't have cities, and so it shall be with us. What are these cities anyway? Absolutely not. There is only our extensive state with its borders, and you will be so kind as to live within it? No, you are not slaves. You are free people, but you labor on public land. So, a redistribution of land. What's important is what these people, this state, did. Something the Akkadians in their time never figured out. They divided the entire territory into provinces. They finally understood that you can organize territory on a principle larger than a city, but smaller than the entire state at once. So provinces appeared. We still don't have a complete list of them. And the first laws appear. If you were told in school that the first laws to reach us were from Hammurabi, that's not true. The first laws to reach us were from Ur-Nammu, from the Third Dynasty of Ur. This is several centuries earlier than Hammurabi. It's just that his list of laws is not as famous and didn't survive as well as Hammurabi's. Now, if you get married, a document is drawn up for every wedding. In general, the emergence of bureaucracy is the great achievement of this second Sumerian Akkadian state, the Third Dynasty of Ur. This was its great achievement. These people essentially create bureaucracy. They create a class of governors who are called the same thing the old chieftains were called, ensi. A special managing governor is appointed to a city, and a lugal, a military commandant, is also appointed there. So in every province, in every large city, because the center of a province was still a city, you now have a person responsible for regular economic affairs and a person responsible for military affairs. It's not entirely clear if this means there were standing armies everywhere. Most likely, this person was in charge of the local militia, but something like a military recruitment office now appeared in all the cities. Yes, there was polygamy, at least for the kings. We know for a fact that Shulgi had 9 wives. How it was for common people is not entirely clear, but there were separate military administrations, and they were located on the frontiers of the state. In the center, for example, in the heartland near the capital Ur, it wasn't necessary to maintain a military administration in a city like Uruk. There, it was only civil and economic. Moreover, a host of reforms took place. This is probably the first example of reforms in history. The same Shulgi who would rule is probably the first reformer ever recorded in history because he changed how the tablets were written. If before they were written vertically in columns, now they began to write in rows. The text is written in a line with a return from left to right. In short, cuneiform began to be written the same way we write. What else was introduced? Taxes. And for the first time, a tax system that is understandable to us was introduced, detailing how it all was arranged. The cities close to Ur paid their taxes to Ur with whatever they produced. For example, if there's a lot of leather in Lagash, they produce leather belts, straps, bindings, and so on. Then Lagash, being a leather city, sells its leather to Ur. Somewhere in Umma, they process reeds, so they pay their tax in reeds. In short, whatever a nearby city produces is what it supplies to the capital. However, if the cities are far away, they pay in livestock, that is, in an equivalent value. They are assigned a quota. For example, you must send 100 rams, you 100 goats, you 100 sheep, you 100 buffalo, you 100 cows, you 100 oxen, you 100 mules, you 100 donkeys. They are all given their assignments. A special city, Nippur, is designated, or rather, it existed before, but it's made into one, as a special transit point where all this livestock is redistributed throughout the entire state. So, if someone from the upper reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates, far from the capital, wants to pay his 100 donkeys, he doesn't drive them all the way across the territory to Ur. He drives them only as far as Nippur, which is located somewhere in the middle of the rivers. He gets them to Nippur, and from there, everything is distributed to where it's needed. For example, if oxen are needed to cultivate land, they go there. If there's a famine somewhere, they go there to be eaten. If a city needs to produce leather and tanners have an order, they are sent there. And so, while Ur is the legislative capital where the rulers live, the city of Nippur becomes, roughly speaking, the economic capital. And from there, of course, we have mountains of sources, just tablets with nothing but the accounting of this livestock. And there are a great many of them. They don't tell us much about political history, but they do tell us a lot about how things were run in this territory. For instance, records about the governors have reached us. We know how they were raised and how they were educated. At the age of 7, you would begin to learn how to write. And interestingly, they accepted women into the bureaucracy. There were clearly fewer of them than men, so maybe it was more difficult for them, but there was no official ban on it. Women also became officials, just as they became priestesses, scribes, and so on. Women were allowed in everywhere. At the same time, the same Shulgi is also proclaimed a god. He is also proclaimed the ruler of the four corners of the universe. And characteristically, they are again looking for ways to rule legitimately. You had this ruler, Shulgi, and at that time, a host of religious hymns were composed that sang his praises. I mean, it was literally a hymn that all the priests had to go out and recite. The text of the hymn was something like, "Behold our ruler Shulgi, look at his mighty paws, see how strong he is. He is the smartest among us. He is the best mathematician. He reads the stars without any instruments. He can predict the future from the entrails of a ram without error. Our Shulgi is the wisest leader. He beats everyone at the game." They had a game. Not chess, of course, but something like backgammon. I don't know what to call it. Again, if someone Googles Sumerian royal game, it will come up right away. It's a board game, a mix of dice, dominoes, and backgammon. He is simply invincible at this game. He is the wisest, the most just. He is the best lover in the entire country. Just ask anyone. He is the only person who knows what justice is. He speaks personally with the gods, and they answer only to him. All of us pray, and the gods don't answer us, but the gods answer Shulgi. That's how cool he is. And this is impressive because someone asked about this. Perhaps the roots of Eastern despotism are laid here. In part, possibly because the reverence for the ruler is total, absolutely total. On paper, it all sounds wonderful, but in practice, this justification for power also failed. The cities still rebelled. Maybe they rebelled less than under Sargon, because at least during the Ur-3 period, we don't read about the king running around day and night putting down rebellions. But there were still quite a few problems. On the other hand, we have many good descriptions from this time. For instance, we know about the slaves and how they were categorized. We know a lot about slavery during the Ur third period, which was unclear in earlier eras. And that's again thanks to the bureaucracy. Everyone complains about bureaucracy, but for history, it leaves behind a multitude of good sources. For example, we know that the majority of slaves were not prisoners of war. The main type of slave was the debt slave. It's when you say, "Dude, lend me some grain, please, so I can plant it. And after I bring in the harvest next year, I'll give you back so much grain that everything will be great. But if you can't pay it back, well, a crop failure, a flood, or something else happens. Then it's, what can you do? Take me as a slave." And that's how one falls into slavery. So debt slavery accounted for the majority of existing slaves at that time. And you would become a slave to the specific person you owed. It was also possible to give your child into slavery instead of yourself, which was done quite often because the logic was, I can always make more kids, but I'm just one adult man. My whole family depends on me. If I go into slavery now, what will I do? So, in principle, you could give a child instead, but this wasn't always an option. Sometimes, if you failed to pay, you had to go into slavery yourself, 100%. There were also prisoners of war as slaves. In theory, debt slavery was considered temporary. In theory, it was until the master felt you had worked off your debt. But in practice, from all appearances, it was forever. We don't find any mention in the sources of a former slave or a freed slave. For some reason, the concept of an ex-slave simply doesn't exist. So, despite the fact that in theory it was all temporary, in practice it was apparently forever. It was like, oh, well, son, that's the situation. Could you buy your way out of slavery? Probably. I mean, as I said, debt slavery was likely considered temporary, but military slavery, if you were a prisoner of war, that was forever. At the same time, there's often a problem with the sources. Yes, a great many tablets have survived, but often we don't understand what they're saying. For example, if a tablet says, "What sorrow our great king Ur-Nammu has died in battle," that's clear. No questions there. It's obvious what the source is talking about. But for example, a tablet might say, "In the 7th year of his reign, King Shulgi placed all 7 statues in the place where they now stand." But we don't know of a single statue in Ur. We haven't found a single one, nothing. So it's completely unclear what statues it's talking about. What are you telling me? In what their places did he put them? It's completely useless information. Okay, he put some statues somewhere. They were probably very beautiful if they were worth mentioning, but they were probably made of precious materials, which is why they didn't survive. A huge number of official titles are listed. They were clearly some kind of officials, but what they did is unclear. What was their position? What did this person do? Roughly speaking, in the source, he might be some kind of Baba Mama. But what this Baba Mama did is a complete mystery. What is that word? How is it read? What does it mean? Nothing is clear. It's obvious it was a term they used for a person, and that's all we know. But what do we know about their leisure time? Well, this also comes from the time of the Third Dynasty of Ur. I remind you folks, this was 40 centuries ago, and it has survived to our time. We know that practically all festivals were accompanied by beer. They drank a lot of beer, a really large amount. What did they eat? They ate the obvious things, like rye and wheat, of course, but they also ate huge quantities of chicken eggs and locusts. There are even frequent descriptions of large swarms of locusts arriving, which is a disaster because it devours the crops. But in Mesopotamia, this was only a partial tragedy. On the one hand, the locusts eat the crops, but on the other hand, you stretch a net in the path of the swarm to stop it, and you basically get your entire harvest back in the form of protein, just in the form of flying locusts. so they didn't really suffer that much. When locust swarms occurred, fried locusts were one of the top dishes, especially as a crunchy snack to go with beer. Apparently, they also had a great fondness for onions, garlic, and cheese. Anything that had a strong smell was, for some reason, highly valued. In fact, onions and garlic were considered elite foods. That is, if you reeked of garlic, it meant you weren't some common person. It meant you were actually quite important. If you were walking around a bit drunk on beer and smelling of cheese and garlic while snacking on locusts, you were a respected person. And characteristically, it is during this time that the Epic of Gilgamesh is compiled, or rather, the oldest complete, fully written down version that we can read from beginning to end has reached us from this period. The problem is that many mythological stories are incomplete. You start a reading and then it just stops because the tablet was broken or something. But from this period, we have a complete epic of Gilgamesh. I recommend reading it. Firstly, you will see many similarities to anything from the Bible to modern superhero films. You'll find direct quotes and be delighted that you found them. But also, the nature of the characters changes, especially Enkidu.
Enkidu is a creature that is half human and half beast, Gilgamesh's close friend. The point is that Enkidu once lived not in a city. He lived like a nomad, out in nature, in a natural way, and he didn't know happiness. He was dull and gray, everything bored him, nothing interested him. He was lonely and uncultured. In general, the theme of loneliness versus companionship is very important. At least in the Gilgamesh text, the theme of loneliness and friendship is probably central. And it is precisely when Enkidu comes to the city that he meets Gilgamesh. He realizes that being alone is bad. He understands that strength lies in friendship. That's one of the reasons Gilgamesh tells the queen goddess Ishtar, "I don't need you and your love whims, because I have a wonderful friend, Enkidu, roughly speaking. I'm not trading my friend for a woman." That line is basically 40 centuries old. So it's like, if I go with you, I'd be abandoning him, and we're friends. Another important theme is the awareness of one's own mortality. Gilgamesh searches for a source of life, for a way to live forever. In principle, he even gets to the point where he is told, if you pass the trials, you will become immortal. And Gilgamesh is a great hero, almost a superhero, but he fails these tests. The moral is that even the best ruler, the best of men, far better than you or I, still couldn't obtain immortality even when he had the chance. And if even he is mortal, then all the more so are we. Therefore, you need to value friendship with Enkidu. You need to value the community we create. And here you can already see that the moral reflects an urban point of view. From every angle, city culture is being celebrated.
Look, we live together, shoulder to shoulder, working and building side by side. And out there, in the wild, running around alone and not even knowing what happiness is, that's a terrible situation you wouldn't wish on anyone. In that sense, this was the last attempt to revive something like a Sumerian legacy. The next era, the next third attempt to build a major state, will happen later in Babylon. For now, we can only say that the third state, Ur, eventually collapsed, although it had, to a large extent, managed to prove that a large state had a right to exist, and there were fewer rebellions against Ur than before. Perhaps it could have survived, but nomadic groups kept arriving from different directions, including large numbers of Semitic-speaking groups, above all the Amorites, whose incursions increasingly pressured this Sumerian Akkadian system. The reasons for the fall were therefore largely military. The state simply wore down under repeated invasions that were difficult to repel. At the same time, the late Ur Third period also shows signs of internal strain. Food shortages and disruptions in grain supply raised costs and weakened the center's ability to hold the provinces together, while rival power bases, such as Isin, gained autonomy. In the end,
Ur fell when Elamite forces and their allies besieged and captured the city, and the last king was taken away captive. The Third Dynasty of Ur was the first attempt in history to build a bureaucratic state with near-total control, where power relied on law, strict accounting, and an ideology that privileged urban civilization. A cultural reflection of this era was the written-down Epic of Gilgamesh, which, through Enkidu's story, argued that socialization and friendship were superior to wild solitude, urging people to value community in the face of inevitable death. However, despite its administrative power and developed economy, the state could not withstand external pressure and fell under the combined strain of sustained incursions and the final blow delivered by invaders from the east.